Imagine we get an Axew egg from an event. Even though the Pokemon can never match your ID to be shiny, it doesn't mean it can't match someone else's. Let's say you trade the egg to your friend, Gary. Gary has a completely different trainer ID and secret ID than you, so the lock that was once applied to the Pokemon no longer matters. But because there's only one of these eggs, Gary has only a 1 in 8,192 chance of getting a shiny Pokemon from it. If it isn't shiny, you'll need to reset before the egg is hatched and trade it to someone else. This creates a reverse shiny hunt, where the shiny Pokemon is hunting the trainer. Technically, you could start a new game, keep playing until you can trade and hatch the egg, and if it isn't shiny, start over. But I envision a different approach. The largest multi-person shiny hunt. One save file, one hatch, one chance. If you're not the right person, you pass it on until the trainer who matches the egg perfectly receives their shiny Pokemon. Now, I'll show you the Pokemon that can have this effect, and the few that are still available today. Many, including the 3 mentioned earlier, have disappeared over time, but one stands out, Manaphy. You've probably heard of the Pokemon Ranger Manaphy egg, which you could trade into Generation 4 after completing Pokemon Ranger. It was one of the hardest shiny hunts, requiring players to repeatedly start new save files and trade back and forth. But I'm not talking about that now, unfortunately, because the Nintendo DS Wi-Fi service shut down, making such a large-scale shiny hunt nearly impossible. However, a few months ago, it was revealed that as a pre-order bonus for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, you'd get the Manaphy egg. In a few days, we'll finally see if the egg behaves in the same way as before, and if it does, I'll start this quest to find the rightful owner of a shiny Manaphy. Every Pokemon has a set of colors that make up its design, which are arranged into a palette within the game's code. These colors appear somewhere in the in-game art of the Pokemon. But for one Pokemon, this isn't true. When adapting certain Pokemon into their sprite versions, the sprite team referenced old Generation 1 artwork, which is proven in sprites like how Machamp doesn't have its belt, and how Nidoqueen shows both of its fangs. These details were only in the original artwork and early in-game sprites. As the official art evolved, features like these were changed in later entries. This brings us to Venomoth. In the code for Ruby and Sapphire, there are unused yellow colors in its palette, which is unusual. The sprite team referenced Generation 1 art for Venomoth, and when you look at that art, it's very different from its current design. The original art lacked the purple hue, showing bright yellow spots on its back, which have been removed from later versions. This change happened during the game's development, and the programmer forgot to update the palette, leaving behind the remnants of yellow hidden in the code. Comparing this block of yellow with the original design, we see almost a perfect match. If you've played Pokemon ROM hacks, you may have tried Renegade Platinum, a difficulty hack for Pokemon Platinum with challenging battles, easy EV training, and many cool changes. Interestingly, it seems like the Pokemon Company might have taken inspiration from this ROM hack, as there's a potential Easter egg hidden in the remakes, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. In recent generations, TM62 was the move Acrobatics, then in Sword and Shield, it became Speed Swap. However, in Renegade Platinum, TM62 was Bug Buzz, and in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, guess what TM62 is now? That's right, Bug Buzz. Could it be a coincidence or an Easter egg? Let me know what you think. A unique item found only in Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal, located in Cerulean Cave, is the Berserk gene. It boosts a Pokemon's attack by 2 stages but also causes confusion, similar to using Swagger on yourself. This might be a nod to the popular theory about the Berserker mushrooms that Vikings used, which induced a trance-like state for Relentless Battlequite, a dark concept for a Pokemon game. In Pokemon XD, Gale of Darkness and Colosseum, there are some interesting changes, particularly the shiny forms of certain Pokemon. One Pokemon that stands out is Vaporeon. A special shout out to my friend Mr. Alpha, who hunted a shiny Eevee in this game, for sharing this. When you evolve Eevee into Vaporeon, it gains a unique snowy aura that no other Pokemon in this or any other game has. Though not exclusive to just the shiny version, It makes the shiny one look amazing. Recently, a fascinating piece of Pokemon Lost media was sent to me by my viewer Bailey, an entire animated short called Pokemon 4D, Pikachu's Ocean Adventure, which was even shown in theaters. The film, described as a 4D experience, featured Pikachu, Latios, and Latias on an underwater treasure hunt with 3D and 4D effects, like spraying water or shaking seats. After its theatrical release, it vanished. It was never released by the Pokemon Company or even uploaded online, making it a true lost piece of media. It's strange for an official film to disappear like this, and if anyone has seen or heard about it, we might be able to uncover what happened or even find the original short. Here's an interesting fact about 3 Pokemon sprites that you've probably never seen: Clefable, Poliwrath, and Golem. These Pokemon have sprites in Pokemon Red and Blue, but they're not used by any trainer, nor can they be found in the wild. The only way to view these sprites was either on a Pokemon's summary screen or during a link cable battle, making them relics of the original 151 sprites that are slightly off or unrecognizable. Another cool detail involves a change to the design of Village Bridge between Pokemon Black and White and Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. The food truck was replaced with a tennis court, but remnants of the food truck still exist in the game's code. If you go to a specific spot and press the right buttons, you can read a sign for the food truck that was left in the game's data, even though the truck itself was removed. A recent discovery for me involves the move Nature Power, which changes based on the terrain. In certain sandy or rocky areas, it can turn into Earthquake, while in water, it becomes Hydro Pump. What's fascinating is a hidden version of this move in Omega, Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire during the Delta episode, when you fight Deoxys in space. In this battle, Nature Power transforms into Draco Meteor, a powerful move. The chance of someone using Nature Power during that battle is low, but it's a neat touch that the developers added. Finally, there's an interesting hidden feature in early Pokemon games. If you press Select and B on a Fire Red or Leaf Green cartridge during the title screen, you can access a feature that lets you connect a link cable to Ruby and Sapphire to fix the infamous berry glitch. There's a hidden feature in Heart Gold and Soul Silver B pressing X, Y, and down on the title screen. A mic test screen featuring a Jigglypuff appears. In Pokepark 2, most Pokemon use their anime voices instead of the usual cries from the main series, which stands out particularly because Porygon Z is in the game, despite Porygon never appearing in the anime. Its voice in this game sounds strange. In Pokemon Go, each type has a background matching it. However, the pure flying type is so rare that before Tornadus was introduced, no Pokemon used the flying type wallpaper, and Tornadus remains the only one to do so. There are several spots in Pokemon games that look like they should allow encounters but don't. For example, in Generation 3, no Pokemon can appear on the first tile inside a cave, and this holds true in other generations too. In Generation 1, the 4 tiles around the fossils don't trigger encounters, even after picking them up. In Meteor Falls in Pokemon Emerald, the first bridge has no encounters either. In Generation 5, a single tile of grass doesn't allow any encounters. It requires at least 2 tiles. This likely helps with finding shaking grass Pokemon, even in small areas. There's an unusual case of a shiny Pokemon changing in the main games. While many shinies changed after Generation 2, few have changed since. However, in a 2013 pre-release showcase of Pokemon X and Y, a shiny Go-Goat appeared that was never seen again. The current shiny looks different from that early version, making it a rare instance where a shiny design was shown and then altered before release. An odd discovery in Pokemon Emerald surfaced in 2021 involving the Battle Pike. When facing a gentleman NPC with a Dusclops that uses Ice Beam, if you press A during the attack, an extra line of dialogue appears where the NPC tells Dusclops to stop. If you don't press anything, that line doesn't show. Also in Emerald, on the second floor of the Sky Pillar, a cracked tile drops the player onto a rock that is normally just a background element. Standing on it does nothing, and you can step off immediately. You can't get back on unless you fall again. The Poison Touch ability introduced in Pokemon Black and White has a 30% chance to poison the opponent. However, in the Japanese versions, the chance was only 20%. If a Japanese and an English version of the game are used in a battle, the Japanese player is at a 10% disadvantage. Lastly, in Generation 5, after choosing a starter, players are forced into a battle with Bianca, regardless of the Pokemon selected. There is a 99% chance of taking at least a little damage during this battle. But what if you don't? Well, if you're lucky enough to get multiple critical hits in a row, have some lucky misses or growls, or if you hack in a stronger starter, you might get through the battle without taking any damage. Sharon will have an extra line of dialogue to address this. It's really cool that this possibility is even considered, given how incredibly unlikely it is. One underappreciated feature of Generation 4 is the dual slot mode in the counter method. Game Freak made use of the DS's 2 game slots by changing the wild Pokemon encounters if you had a Game Boy game inserted while playing through Diamond, Pearl, or Platinum. Once you finish the game, this unlocks some unique encounters like Zangoose on Route 208 or Pineco on Route 204, and Solrock and Lunatone in Lake Verity if you have Ruby or Sapphire in the DS slot. However, something strange happens in Lake Verity when you insert Fire Red or Leaf Green. Instead of the usual new encounter, you get low-level Bidoof and Starly, which spawn at a 4% rate. This doesn't happen anywhere else, and it seems more like a programming glitch than an intentional design. These Pokemon can also be shiny, making them one of the rarest shiny encounters in Generation 3. There are hidden storylines in the games that act like side quests, which many players probably never noticed unless they've explored every corner of the Generation 3 games. One example starts with a hidden trainer in Ruby and Sapphire, a psychic named Jacqueline. She's so well hidden that you might not even know she exists, and her story picks up again in Fire Red and Leaf Green, where she is found on the Sevi Island. She appears to have teleported to the wrong place and got stuck, and by then, her Pokemon, including her original Abra, have evolved. It's a small but interesting story to uncover. In Pokemon Emerald, there is a rare candy hidden in Area 6 of the Safari Zone that cannot be interacted with from the top or left side. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, a text message can appear from Lyra on the Pokegear, saying her Marill evolved into Azumarill, but when you check, it's still a Marill. Another interesting detail about Pokemon anatomy is that the colors on the ends of Magnemite's magnets can turn on and off, as seen in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. As for Slowpoke's tail, it's always been teased as a forbidden fruit, and we've all wondered how tasty it really is. However, if you were to hack one into Heart Gold and Soul Silver, you'll find that it can't be eaten and is just a key item in Generation 4. There was also a glitch in the GTS that let players get an item called the Seal Bag, which holds 10 seals, but it's just a less effective version of the seal case. In Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Pokemon finally follow you again, but due to the new art style, the full-scale models from Sword and Shield wouldn't really work, so some Pokemon appear smaller. Speaking of size, this is what Wailord would look like if it were full-scale. Shadow Lugia is considered one of the coolest Pokemon designs ever, while Vanillite is often seen as one of the worst, though I secretly like it. Both were designed by the same person. In Pokemon Black and White, Tepig's sprite seems to have slightly changed on the starter selection screen depending on the version. Do you like this personality? In the beta version, one noticeable difference is that his leg appears much thinner compared to the final release. There's also an unused move in the files of Generation 6 called Light of Ruin, a fairy-type move with 140 base power. Had it been included in the game, it would have been the strongest fairy-type move, second only to Z-moves. In the bug-catching contest in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, if the player has a full party and their newly caught Pokemon is sent to the PC, it is labelled as Bill's PC instead of someone's PC. Even if the player has not yet met Bill, there's a small continuity error in Generation 4 during the member card event. When the player falls into a nightmare to capture Darkrai on New Moon Island, the underground can still be accessed at any time, even though the player is supposed to be asleep. Another oddity is that Burn Tower in Heart Gold and Soul Silver is classified as a cave area, not a building, in the game's code. This is also true for Bell Tower and Sprout Tower. These areas are classified as caves likely to allow Pokemon to spawn inside. Burn Tower will also take on a sandy appearance instead of its usual trashy look when battling there. Speaking of Sprout Tower, it was once considered for a stage in Smash Bros. Early in development. I have to admit, this next fact is really interesting. When the Sinnoh remakes were coming out, I hoped for a 3D version of the original Generation 4 shiny sparkles, which were the best in my opinion. Unfortunately, we didn't get that, and the sparkles are similar to those in Sword and Shield. However, there's a unique difference. These sparkles are completely random. They act more like a particle effect that comes from the Pokemon and changes slightly each time the Pokemon is sent out, which is pretty cool. Credit to Anubis on Twitter for discovering this. The move struggle can only be used when all of a Pokemon's move power points are depleted. Interestingly, struggle has contest stats, even though it can't be used in contests, as moves don't use PP during them. It probably has these stats to prevent the game from crashing if modified. In Gold and Silver, there are unused text lines showing that instead of headbutting trees, it was originally intended to be activated with honey, which was originally called Sweet Honey. There's even text suggesting players would slather it on trees, much like in Generation 4. Speaking of unused text, one of the worst weather conditions ever introduced in Pokemon was fog, as it caused moves to miss half the time without the use of an HM. Thankfully, it was only in Generation 4, but fog nearly made a return in Generation 5, as 2 lines of text recovered from the game file suggest it was almost included. There's also a weird glitch in Pokemon Home when importing Farfetch'd or Sirfetch'd. They are treated as though they have a nickname and cannot be renamed when transferred back to Sword and Shield. This is because Pokemon Home assigns them the wrong apostrophe, and the glitch was never fixed during the entirety of Sword and Shield's life cycle. Champion Diane is considered to have the most balanced team of any champion because each of her 6 Pokemon has a different highest stat: Hawlucha for speed, Tyrantrum for attack, Aurorus for HP, Gulgeist for defense, Goodra for special defense, and Gardevoir for special attack. In Generation 3, there's a strange error in the status screen for the move Water Sport, as it states that the move has 100% accuracy, despite targeting the entire field and ignoring accuracy and evasion checks. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Regigigas has the widest overworld sprite of any Pokemon. Nosepass was programmed to learn the move Head Smash through breeding as an egg move, but no other Pokemon in the mineral group could pass it down. In Generation 5, this was removed from Nosepass's egg move list, and in later games, other Pokemon can pass it down, though Nosepass can no longer learn it. Finally, there is a patch of grass in the Johto region that was only present in Pokemon Crystal, not in Gold, Silver, Heart Gold, or Soul Silver. After using your final move in the battle, the Pokemon will flee. I wanted to test if I could get a critical hit and lose to see what would happen, so I repeated the sequence about 20 times. Eventually, I managed to land a strong tackle on myself, ensuring I died. The usual text, saying you'll win, still appears, but as soon as you exit the battle, the cutscene with Professor Birch continues normally, even though it initially stated that you won. There's a small detail that I doubt many have noticed about the way Ho-Oh is encountered in this game. In Pokemon lore, Ho-Oh is the guardian of the skies, with rainbows shining from its wings, making it a mystical firebird. The developers wanted to convey this as you ascend Naval Rock to meet Ho-Oh. You're greeted by a cloudy, grey sky, but once you encounter the legendary Ho-Oh, the sky becomes a vibrant, fiery blue. What really surprised me is that after defeating Ho-Oh, the sky stays bright blue permanently, affecting the area as if to show the Pokemon's immense power. I've never seen such a purposeful design in a Pokemon game, and I find it a fascinating touch. If I asked you when the move Waterfall was introduced, most would say Generation 2. However, it was actually present from the very beginning in the original Red and Blue games. It had the same base power, but without the ability to climb waterfalls. The reason it was hidden so well is that it wasn't a TM or HM, and it was only learned by 2 Pokemon Goldeen and Seeking at level 39, which made it even harder to access. Most players wouldn't have a Seeking on their Elite Four team, making this a rare discovery. One of my favorite aspects of early Pokemon is how the developers hid world-building elements in the environments, leaving it to the player to notice. A great example is the hidden Wailord in Black and White 2's Marine Tube, which only appears for a few hours in the day. There's also a lesser-known secret in Driftveil City's Driftveil Drawbridge. If you stand still for a while, you'll hear the sounds of planes and helicopters, along with Charizard's cry, because the bridge is sometimes called Charizard Bridge, a little Easter egg from the developers. In Pokemon Crystal, after beating the 8th gym leader Claire, you must take a test in Dragon's Den to prove you're worthy of the badge. If you lose your last Pokemon to poison damage just before leaving, you still get the Dragon Breath TM. Strangely, if you return to Claire's gym afterward, she gives you the TM again, even though you technically already received it. In Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, on Route 225, there's an NPC with an interesting Easter egg that you probably missed. Ace Trainer Dean has a Tropius in a Cherish Ball, even though Cherish Balls are usually only obtainable through event Pokemon. This is a nod to the first ever event Pokemon, Tropius, distributed in a Cherish Ball back in 2007. After you make your final move in battle, it will escape. I was curious to see if I could land a critical hit and lose the battle to observe what happens, so I replayed the sequence about 20 times. Eventually, I managed to get a high damage tackle on me, right when I was about to faint. All the regular text about winning out still appears, but as soon as the battle ends, the cutscene with Professor Birch continues as usual, even though the text said I would win. Here's a small detail about how you encounter Ho-Oh that I bet few have noticed. In Pokemon lore, Ho-Oh is known as the Guardian of the Skies, with rainbows shining from its wings, embodying the mystical Firebird. The developers wanted to reflect this aura when you encounter Ho-Oh. As you ascend Naval Rock to meet it, you're greeted by a murky, grey sky until Ho-Oh appears, turning the sky into a bright, fiery blue. What's even more interesting is that after defeating Ho-Oh, the sky remains bright blue permanently in that area. It's a unique detail that shows the Pokemon's pure power to influence the environment, which is something I've never seen in Pokemon before. It's a purposeful touch, creating a lasting impact on the player's experience. If I asked you which generation introduced the move Waterfall, many would probably say Gen 2. However, it's less known that Waterfall actually existed in the games since the very first release in Pokemon Red and Blue. It's the same move, with the same base power, but without the ability to climb waterfalls. This was hidden because Waterfall wasn't a TM, HM, or commonly used in the game. It could only be learned by 2 Pokemon Goldeen and Seeking, and even then, they didn't learn it until level 39, making it very inaccessible since most players don't have Seeking on their Elite Four team. Another favourite motif in early Pokemon is how world-building elements are hidden in the environment, encouraging players to discover them. A great example of this is the hidden Wailord in Black and White 2's Marine Tube, which only appears between 3 and 5 PM. If you spot it, you even earn a medal. There's also a lesser-known secret on the Driftveil Drawbridge in Driftveil City. If you stand still and wait a bit, you can hear planes, helicopters, and even the cry of Charizard, a reference to the bridge being sometimes called Charizard Bridge. If you've played Pokemon Crystal, you might remember that, after defeating the 8th gym leader, Claire, you must go into the Dragon's Den and pass a test to prove your worth. Afterward, Claire gives you the TM for Dragon Breath. But what happens if, before you leave, your last Pokemon dies from poison damage? Would you miss out on the TM? Actually, no. You still get 2 Dragon Breath T miss. If you enter Claire's gym again, she will repeat her usual dialogue, and then when you go back to the Dragon Center, the cutscene triggers again, and you receive a second Dragon Breath TM. In Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, on Route 225, there's an NPC, Ace Trainer Dean, who hides an Easter egg. She has a Tropius in a Cherish Ball, which is typically only available through event Pokemon. This isn't a mistake, it's a reference to the very first event Pokemon distributed in a Cherish Ball, which was a Tropius in 2007. As part of a campaign for an older Japanese Pokemon-themed television show, There's an interesting detail in the Pokemon League, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald games that you may not know. The speed at which the lights flash. The speed varies depending on the game's localization. In the Japanese versions, the lights flash much faster compared to the North American release. In Generation 1, Aerodactyl couldn't learn Earthquake, but when transferred to Gold, Silver, or Crystal, it could. This becomes noteworthy when using Pokemon Stadium's time capsule feature. If you trade an Aerodactyl with Earthquake from Gold, Silver, Crystal back to Generation 1, and then into Stadium, you'll see a unique attack animation for Earthquake that doesn't appear elsewhere. This is the only time this animation occurs in the game, and it was impossible to see between the release of Stadium and Gold, Silver, Crystal. In June 2008, a Deoxys event was held for Pokemon Diamond and Pearl at GameStop locations in the US, but there was a mix-up in the flyer promoting the event, where it mentioned Darkrai instead of Deoxys. Also, in Pokemon Black and White 2, if you don't collect the Max Potion from Route 11, the dowsing machine will detect a hidden item, but once the Max Potion is collected, the hidden item disappears. In the early 2000s, it was common for Pokemon games to be released in Japan a year before the US. Many kids grew up with Pokemon Stadium and its sequel, but the history of Pokemon Stadium in Japan is quite different. In Japan, there was a third Pokemon Stadium game, which was never released in the US, referred to by fans as Pokemon Stadium Zero. It launched on the 1st of August, 1998, just a month before the North American release of Pokemon Red and Blue. This made it incredibly obscure, especially since the West didn't even know about Pokemon at the time. Pokemon Stadium Zero had a limited roster of just 42 Pokemon, excluding many unevolved and middle evolution forms. The game required a Game Boy game and a transfer pack to function beyond battles, and there were plans for an expansion via the 64DD, but due to delays, they released Pokemon Stadium 2 instead, which is known as Pokemon Stadium 1 in the US. So, Japan had 3 Pokemon Stadium games, but the third one remains a forgotten part of Pokemon's history. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, there's a strange oddity in Cherry Grove City. When you return to this early game town with Surf, you can access a patch of water that's technically part of Route 30. However, if you surf south, the location tag changes to Cherry Grove City. This seems normal at first, but when you encounter Pokemon in different areas of the water, the encounter is registered as though you're in the ocean west of Cherry Grove, creating a bizarre situation where 2 different tile sets appear in the same body of water. Lastly, a quick but funny one. In the games, Drifloon appears in the Valley Windworks on Fridays. This small encounter has no real story importance, but is a quirky detail worth mentioning. While progressing through the story of Diamond and Pearl and reaching the peak of Mount Coronet, where the story reaches its climax, you might recall a scene where the sky is filled with various colors, flashing to scenes from the map, including Valley Windworks. If you finish the story on a Friday when Drifloon spawns, you can briefly spot it floating during a flash of the camera in that cutscene. It's a very quick moment, but it's a cool detail. What's even better is that this feature is also present in the remakes, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, in full HD. One of my favorite aspects of Pokemon trivia is finding little Easter eggs in other media, like the hidden Pikachu in Osmosis Jones. Recently, I came across something interesting in the 2011 game Catherine. While the game isn't connected to Pokemon in any way, I was surprised to discover an unused music track in its files that sounds very similar to the battle theme from Diamond and Pearl. It's believed to be a variation of that theme, although it doesn't appear in regular gameplay. If you've spent a lot of time playing Black and White 2, you might know that there are multiple types of sparkle effects for Pokemon, not just shiny ones. One is of course for shiny Pokemon, but there are also star animations that you get after finishing a Pokestar Studios movie with a strange ending. You've probably seen this effect before. There's a third kind, too. To trigger this final sparkle, you need to first complete the original Black and White games. When you start Black and White 2, you can use the memory link feature. This will cause Pokemon that you used in the first game to appear in the wild at a 1% spawn rate throughout Black and White 2. These Pokemon will have a special sparkle effect. But if you have a shiny Pokemon and use it in PokeStar Studios to get the strange ending, its star animation will replace the normal shiny sparkles forever. So, what happens if we make one of these wild N Pokemon shiny? Would the N sparkles or shiny sparkles show? After testing it, we found that both sparkles appear together, which looks amazing in the game. It's unfortunate that N's Pokemon can't be shiny, though, because this would be a great feature. One of my favorite lesser-known pieces of Pokemon trivia is when two Pokemon are linked through their design and lore. Take Zangoose and Seviper, for example, but even less well-known are Miltank and Tauros. They share the same base stat total, spawn in the same areas, and are based on similar animals. But there's a pair that might be really easy to miss: Trubbish and Minun. Minun's design revolves around its tail being used as a broom for cleaning, and it prefers tidy habitats, according to its Pokédex. This detail might seem random at first, but it actually makes a lot of sense when you notice where Minun spawns in Sunday and Moonlight next to a recycling plant. Additionally, Trubbish, the trash Pokemon, is often found in more unsanitary locations. The implication is that Minun cleans up after Trubbish, and this cute little detail is something that not many people notice, but I love when Pokemon sneaks in these kinds of connections. I also came across an interesting Japanese article about game design, which featured some critical members of Game Freak. They discussed a mechanic in Scarlet and Violet that I didn't know existed, called the Meow system. It started when a programmer, Kitamura, visited mountains and zoos to observe how animals make sounds throughout the day and night. They discovered that many medium-sized mammals remain silent at night, while the only sounds you hear are bugs. They incorporated this into the game, and the interview provided behind-the-scenes photos showing how this was implemented. As morning comes, birds start to chirp, reflecting this real-world observation. Let's say you get an Exu egg from an event. Even though it can't be shiny for you due to how trainer IDs work, that doesn't mean it can't be shiny for someone else. If you trade the egg to a friend, let's call him Gary, who has a different trainer ID and secret ID, the original shiny lock no longer applies. But because you only have one egg, there's just a 1 in 8,192 chance that Gary's ID matches what the egg needs to be shiny. If it's not shiny, he resets to before the egg hatches and trades it to someone else. It becomes a reverse shiny hunt where the shiny Pokemon is looking for the right trainer. You could keep restarting the game and trading the egg over and over until you get lucky. But there's another idea: a massive, community-based shiny hunt. One game, one hatch, one shot. If you're not the match, you pass it on until someone finally gets the shiny and becomes its true trainer. Here are the Pokemon affected by this mechanic, and among those still obtainable today, very few remain. Many are no longer available, but one stands out: Manaphy. You might know the Manaphy egg from Pokemon Ranger. After finishing that game, you could transfer the egg to Gen 4, a shiny hunt that required repeated new save files and lots of trading. But now, with Nintendo DS Wi-Fi services shut down, that kind of hunt is nearly impossible. However, a few months ago it was revealed that pre-orders of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl would include the Manaphy egg. In a few days from that announcement, it would become clear whether the egg still behaved the same way, and if it did, a hunt would begin to find the one person who could hatch the shiny. Now, switching topics. Every Pokemon has a set of colors stored in the game code that make up its design, and these colors are used in the in-game art. But for one Pokemon, this isn't quite true. When converting many older Pokemon to sprite form, developers used Generation 1 artwork as their reference. For example, Machamp was drawn without a belt, and Nidoqueen was shown with both fang traits only seen in the original art and early sprites. Later games updated these designs, but Venomoth is a strange case. Its sprite in Ruby and Sapphire contains several yellow tones in the code that are never actually used. This suggests that the sprite was based on Venomoth's original Gen 1 art, where it had a bright yellow back and no purple tones. That version of Venomoth was later redesigned, and the yellow markings disappeared from all future art. Yet, a trace of it remains in the unused yellow pixels hidden in the Gen 3 code, a leftover of a scrapped design that almost made it in. Lastly, if you've explored Pokemon ROM hacks, you might have played Renegade Platinum, a fan-made version of Platinum with tougher battles, streamlined training, and other improvements. Interestingly, the official games might have included a nod to it. For example, in recent mainline games, TM62 has changed its moves several times. In Renegade Platinum, TM62 was Bug Buzz. In Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, it's also Bug Buzz. Coincidence? Maybe. Hidden reference? Also possible. Imagine receiving an event egg, and while the Pokemon will never match your ID to be shiny, it could match someone else's. Suppose you trade the egg to a friend who has a completely different trainer ID and secret ID. The lock that applied to the Pokemon no longer has an effect, but since you only have one egg, your friend only has a 1 in 8, 192 chance of the egg being shiny. If it's not shiny, your friend would need to reset before hatching the egg and give it to someone else, making it a reverse shiny hunt where the Pokemon is hunting the trainer. You could start a new game and keep trying until you hatch a shiny, but I have a different idea. The largest multi-person shiny hunt. One save file, one hatch, one chance. If it's not the right trainer, you pass the egg on until the perfect match is found. There are some Pokemon that can have this effect, but very few are obtainable today. Many, including some from earlier, have been lost to time. However, one still stands out, the Manaphy egg. You may have heard of Iton Egg you could trade into Generation 4 after completing Pokemon Ranger, one of the hardest shiny hunts. It required starting new save files and trading back and forth, but sadly, that's not possible now due to the Nintendo DS Wi-Fi shutdown. However, a few months ago, it was announced that pre-ordering Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl would come with the Manaphy egg, and soon we'll know if it behaves the same way as before. If it does, I'll begin my quest to find the rightful owner of a shiny Manaphy. Each Pokemon has a set of colors making up their design, which is stored in the game's code as a palette. However, for one Pokemon, this isn't the case. When adapting many Pokemon into sprites for the games, the design is referenced to older Generation 1 artwork. This can be seen in other sprites, like how Machamp lacks its belt, or how Nidoqueen displays both of its fangs, features that were only in the original artwork. As official art evolved, these features were removed, and this brings us to Venomoth's oddity. In Ruby and Sapphire, Venomoth's code contains several unused yellow hues in its palette. This isn't normal, it's because the designers were referencing the Generation 1 Venomoth art, which was very different from its current design. The original Venomoth had yellow spots on its back that are now entirely missing in every official version of the Pokemon. This change occurred during the game's development, and the coder responsible for the palette swap missed a few details, leaving behind a hidden piece of history-unused yellow code. Comparing this to the original art shows a near-perfect match. If you've ever explored Pokemon ROM hacks, you might have played Renegade Platinum, a difficulty hack for Pokemon Platinum with tougher battles and tons of changes. Interestingly, it seems the Pokemon Company may have borrowed some elements from this ROM hack. In previous generations, TM62 was acrobatics, but in Sword and Shield, it became Speed Swap. However, in Renegade Platinum, TM62 was Bug Buzz, and in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, TM62 is also Bug Buzz. Could this be a coincidence, or is it a possible Easter egg? Let me know what you think. Imagine receiving an event Axew egg. Even though the Pokemon can't be shiny for you due to your trainer and secret ID combination, that doesn't mean it can't be shiny for someone else. If you trade the egg to a friend, let's call him Gary, who has a completely different ID, the shiny lock from your game no longer applies. Gary now has a 1 in 8, 192 chance of the egg being shiny. If it isn't, he must reset 2 before the egg was hatched and pass it to someone else. It's a reversed, shiny hunt where the Pokemon seeks the trainer. While you could theoretically keep restarting new games, trading, and hatching the egg until it's shiny, there's a different vision. A massive, multi-person shiny hunt. One save file, one hatch, one chance. If it's not shiny, pass it on until the right trainer is found someone whose ID makes the egg shiny. That person is the egg's true match. There are only a few Pokemon that work this way, and even fewer still obtainable today. Many, including a few notable ones, are now lost with time, but one stands out: Manaphy. You may have heard of the Manaphy egg from Pokemon Ranger, which could be transferred to Gen 4 after finishing the Gamia notoriously difficult shiny hunt that involves resetting and trading. Unfortunately, the DS Wi-Fi service shutdown makes large-scale hunts difficult. However, a few months ago, it was announced that pre-orders for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl would include the Manaphy egg. In just a few days from that announcement, it would be revealed if the egg retains the same shiny behavior. If so, a new hunt begins to find the person who matches with a shiny Manaphy. Every Pokemon's design uses a color palette coded into the game. Each color appears somewhere in its in-game art except for one Pokemon. When adapting older designs for newer sprites, developers use Generation 1 art as a reference, as seen with Machamp missing its belt and Kingler showing both Fang's features exclusive to early artwork. These details were later removed in official art, leading to differences. This brings us to Venomoth. When examining its data in Ruby and Sapphire, several yellow colors appear in its palette that went unused in the final sprite. This isn't normal. The developers likely referenced Gen 1 art, which shows Venomoth with bright yellow spots instead of the now standard purple. These yellow markings vanished not only from the Ruby and Sapphire sprites but from all future versions. The original color change likely happened mid-development, but the palette was never fully updated, leaving this unused yellow in the game's code as the only trace. If you've ever tried Pokemon ROM hacks, you might know Renegade Platinuma, difficulty mod of Pokemon Platinum with intense battles and enhancements. Interestingly, it appears that the official games might have nodded to this ROM hack. TM62 has changed moves across generations: Acrobatics, then Speed Swap. In Renegade Platinum, TM62 was Bug Buzz. In Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, TM62 is now also Bug Buzz. Coincidence? Maybe. Possible Easter egg? Also maybe. One Seal has arguably the most unimaginative name in all of Pokemon. It's called Seal, and it's literally a seal. Amazing, right? At least when it evolves, it gets a unique name. Interestingly, in the original Pokemon Red and Blue Beta, Dunsparce was supposed to be named Manatee. Moving on, while friendship played a significant role in Generation 2, you might not know it was actually introduced in Generation 1, but it only impacted one Pokemon, your partner Pikachu, in Pokemon Yellow. What's more, friendship affected Pikachu's walking speed. If its friendship stat is 80 or higher, Pikachu's walking animations are 5 times faster. Big thanks to my friend and Pokemon streamer, Troll, for pointing this out. Many people assume that the color of shiny Pokemon is just a simple palette swap, but that's not always the case. After hearing this next fact, you'll likely look at every shiny Pokemon differently. This one comes from Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald in the Mount Pyre area. 3 Pokemon spawn at the summit: Duskull, Shuppet, and Kecleon. Their shiny colors represent the mascot colors of the region, blue and green. But that's not all. Duskull and Shuppet symbolize Groudon and Kyogre, disruptive forces causing chaos, much like the legendary Pokemon in the story. Meanwhile, the green Pokemon, shiny Kecleon, symbolizes Rayquaza, the protector who calms the situation. In Japanese culture, bells have long been associated with protection, as their sound is believed to ward off evil. It's not hard to see Kecleon as a mediator, just like Rayquaza in the games. While this isn't definitive, it's fun to think about and analyze. Thanks to Iceflame in my community for sharing this. Another cool feature in the games is how, when your Pokemon is low on health, it appears dizzy when released and can't be interacted with. It'll return to its Pokeball in a few seconds, unlike a healthy Pokemon which stays out until you either put it away or run. In addition, the ability to catch Pokemon without battling is a fantastic new feature. A neat touch here is that when you catch a Pokemon outside of battle, your character actually reacts happily. In Jubilife City, there's an NPC gardener who asks you to bring him a ground-type Pokemon for some heavy lifting. Interestingly, If you bring him an alpha Pokemon, he acknowledges its size with a unique dialogue line, just a fun little detail. You've probably heard about the 1 in 64 chance of seeing a hiker while riding the cable car in Route 112 of Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. I mentioned this fact in a video nearly 2 years ago, but I've always wondered if that's the only thing that can appear. Some people have commented about seeing a Latias, but I've never seen proof. However, I discovered that in Pokemon Emerald, there's also a 1 in 64 chance to see a Zigzagoon walking up the mountain while riding the cable car. Unfortunately, due to a bug, the Zigzagoon never actually appears in the game, so it was unused, but thanks to a YouTube channel, we can still see what it would have looked like. Is this conversation helpful so far? I spent a long time trying to find information online about this, but there isn't much out there. I waited around for a while, hoping it would appear, but nothing really happened. Eventually, I figured out that it's a small animation of a Pokemon that loops every few minutes, similar to other animations, like the one on top of the roof or in the pool. Some websites mention that this Pokemon will give you a present ball, but I couldn't get it to do that, even when I caught it while it was going up the chimney. It seems like it's just part of a random animation, and whether or not you see it is left to chance. Still, it's pretty cool. There's also a very rare cutscene, possibly rarer than encountering a shiny Pokemon, that very few people have ever seen naturally. It's possible for an NPC's Pokemon to accidentally knock out a wild Pokemon during a tutorial, but only under very rare conditions. According to some sources, certain stats must align for this to happen. If it does, the cutscene will play as if the wild Pokemon was captured, even though it wasn't. In the 7th generation of Pokemon, there's a forgotten island called Executor Island. Most players don't visit it often since it's small and simple, but there's a hidden event cutscene that many miss. To trigger it, you need to complete a small story on the island, where you hide from the rain in a cave. After that, you can trigger the cutscene, but it took me a while to figure out how. Standing on it does nothing, and you can step off immediately. You can't get back on unless you fall again. The Poison Touch ability introduced in Pokemon Black and White has a 30% chance to poison the opponent. However, in the Japanese versions, the chance was only 20%. If a Japanese and an English version of the game are used in a battle, the Japanese player is at a 10% disadvantage. Lastly, in Generation 5, after choosing a starter, players are forced into a battle with Bianca, regardless of the Pokemon selected. There is a 99% chance of taking at least a little damage during this battle. But what if you don't? Well, if you're lucky enough to get multiple critical hits in a row, have some lucky misses or growls, or if you hack in a stronger starter, you might get through the battle without taking any damage. Sharon will have an extra line of dialogue to address this. It's really cool that this possibility is even considered, given how incredibly unlikely it is. One underappreciated feature of Generation 4 is the dual slot mode in the counter method. Game Freak made use of the DS's 2 game slots by changing the wild Pokemon encounters if you had a Game Boy game inserted while playing through Diamond, Pearl, or Platinum. Once you finish the game, this unlocks some unique encounters like Zangoose on Route 208 or Pineco on Route 204, and Solrock and Lunatone in Lake Verity if you have Ruby or Sapphire in the DS slot. However, something strange happens in Lake Verity when you insert Fire Red or Leaf Green. Instead of the usual new encounter, you get low-level Bidoof and Starly, which spawn at a 4% rate. This doesn't happen anywhere else, and it seems more like a programming glitch than an intentional design. These Pokemon can also be shiny, making them one of the rarest shiny encounters in Generation 3. There are hidden storylines in the games that act like side quests, which many players probably never noticed unless they've explored every corner of the Generation 3 games. One example starts with a hidden trainer in Ruby and Sapphire, a psychic named Jacqueline. She's so well hidden that you might not even know she exists, and her story picks up again in Fire Red and Leaf Green, where she is found on the Sevi Island. She appears to have teleported to the wrong place and got stuck, and by then, her Pokemon, including her original Abra, have evolved. It's a small but interesting story to uncover. In Pokemon Emerald, there is a rare candy hidden in Area 6 of the Safari Zone that cannot be interacted with from the top or left side. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, a text message can appear from Lyra on the Pokegear, saying her Meryl evolved into Azumarill, but when you check, it's still a Meryl. Another interesting detail about Pokemon anatomy is that the colors on the ends of Magnemite's magnets can turn on and off, as seen in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. As for Slowpoke's tail, it's always been teased as a forbidden fruit, and we've all wondered how tasty it really is. However, if you were to hack one into Heart Gold and Soul Silver, you'll find that it can't be eaten and is just a key item in Generation 4. There was also a glitch in the GTS that let players get an item called the Seal Bag, which holds 10 seals, but it's just a less effective version of the seal case. In Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Pokemon finally follow you again, but due to the new art style, the full-scale models from Sword and Shield wouldn't really work, so some Pokemon appear smaller. Speaking of size, this is what Wailord would look like if it were full-scale. Shadow Lugia is considered one of the coolest Pokemon designs ever, while Vanillite is often seen as one of the worst, though I secretly like it. Both were designed by the same person. In Pokemon Black and White, Tepig's sprite seems to have slightly changed on the starter selection screen depending on the version. Do you like this personality? In the beta version, one noticeable difference is that his leg appears much thinner compared to the final release. There's also an unused move in the files of Generation 6 called Light of Ruin, a fairy-type move with 140 base power. Had it been included in the game, it would have been the strongest fairy-type move, second only to Z-moves. In the bug-catching contest in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, if the player has a full party and their newly caught Pokemon is sent to the PC, it is labelled as Bill's PC instead of someone's PC. Even if the player has not yet met Bill, there's a small continuity error in Generation 4 during the member card event. When the player falls into a nightmare to capture Darkrai on New Moon Island, the underground can still be accessed at any time, even though the player is supposed to be asleep. Another oddity is that Burn Tower in Heart Gold and Soul Silver is classified as a cave area, not a building, in the game's code. This is also true for Bell Tower and Sprout Tower. After this conversation, the bookshelf in the library, which usually only has one line of text, will now be filled with lore about the Arceus plates, written by the NPC who could only be met at Toys R Us in 2009 during the event. If you cheat the Toys R Us Arceus into your game, the cutscene won't play. You have to have attended the event for it to trigger. I'm curious how many people know about this cutscene or were actually there in person to experience it. In Generation 3, during the ending cutscene, as your character bikes through Hoenn, flashes of Pokemon briefly appear on screen. These Pokemon are randomly selected from your own Pokedex, rather than being fixed, making each viewing unique. With this in mind, my friend and I used a cheat to walk through walls and rare candies to reach the Elite Four with only a Mudkip in our Pokedex. We used a team of Mudkips to defeat the Elite Four and enter the Hall of Fame, witnessing a unique version of the ending. As for the shiny Mudkips, I wanted to see if they'd appear shiny in the cutscene, but they don't, although it didn't lessen the experience. In Black and White 2, there's a memorable cutscene where Ghetsis summons Kyurem and tries to attack the player, only to be interrupted by N. However, before this happens, if you walk through a wall into a hidden area, you can find Kyurem waiting out of bounds. When Ghetsis summons Kyurem, it disappears from this corner. It would be amazing if you could interact with it, but unfortunately you can't. This makes me think there might be other hidden characters like N and Zekrom that could be lurking somewhere in the game, though I couldn't find them. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, there are some intriguing secrets in the national park. The central pond may seem like a simple, decorative feature, but it has a hidden mechanic. If you activate the Walk Through Walls cheat, you can surf on the water, even fish there, although nothing bites. You can also get stuck on the rim of the fountain, requiring you to fly out. Additionally, if you explore the trees around the national park and walk through walls, you'll find a hidden area with NPCs waiting for the bug-catching contest. Their dialogue is intact, though they don't appear in the main game. Perhaps the most fascinating secret was discovered by a viewer who worked on the decompilation of the Heart Gold and Soul Silver games. They found hidden warps in the national park, particularly in the northwest corner, near some trees above a flower. These warps lead to an unused gate that would have connected the Pokeathlon to the national park, but it was scrapped and moved to Goldenrod City. Now, this gate remains unused, and players have unknowingly walked past it for years. In the storyline of these games, you board the Plasma Frigate, the large ship near the seaside cave. However, it appears the frigate was not originally intended to be located on Route 21. If you bypass the walls, you can reach a normally inaccessible ledge. Stepping on a specific tile here warps you directly to the Plasma Frigate, suggesting it was initially meant to dock in this area, but the warp point was left in place during development. Another unused warp in Black and White 2 occurs during the final Plasma event. In this room there's a hidden warp off to the left, out of bounds. By using the walk-through walls cheat and passing through the walls, you'll eventually be warped to the other side of an electric fence. Interestingly, this version of the room seems abnormal, as no dialogue appears from any character, even if the electric fences are down. Once you leave and reset the room, the fences disappear, adding to the mystery. Another curious discovery occurs in Chargestone Cave. Right before crossing a bridge, you're halted and see some text, but no character is visible. If you walk over without triggering the text, End Sprite can be seen just off-screen, confirming he's the one delivering the line. This is the only other time his presence is noted in the main story, besides at the very end. You can't interact with him, but it's a neat hidden detail that was included, even though it's never revealed in normal gameplay. Lastly, there's an unusual NPC in Cerulean City that most players wouldn't remember. Hidden in a house at the bottom of the city, this NPC only says one line of dialogue and watches television. If you speak to him after finishing the game, he still only responds with this line. At first, he seems like a filler character, but he actually has a hidden purpose. This NPC is waiting for the player to complete a specific task that unlocks more of his dialogue. Unfortunately, the method to unlock this dialogue has been forgotten over time, and very little is known about it. However, there's a clue tied to the television he watches. This ties back to a feature that was originally planned for Fire Red and Leaf Green, where a news feature was to distribute Pokemon-related updates through a Wonder Card-like system. It was a way to send virtual letters to players. However, since the Game Boy Advance couldn't connect to the internet, these updates had to be received via the mystery gift feature at specific locations, such as a Pokemon Center in Tokyo. Although this feature was experimental and never fully implemented, a YouTuber in Japan recently uncovered one of these original letters, confirming the feature's existence. Raichu's Pokédex entry is very similar to the one from Pokemon Green and the translation in Pokemon Fire Red, with one notable difference. In the original, it mentions that Raichu's electric charge can reach up to 100,000 volts, and careless contact can cause an Indian elephant to faint. In the updated version, however, the reference is changed to a Pokemon called Karaja, which makes more sense. It's crazy that it took so long for an elephant Pokemon to appear. Many characters in Pokemon Legends are based on figures from the original Diamond and Pearl series, though this is never explicitly stated. Hints throughout the game suggest this connection, and one of them is related to Arazu. Based on the character's hair, it's clear that Arazu is supposed to be an ancestor of Mars from Team Galactic. Interestingly, Arazu's name is a version of the Japanese pronunciation of Ares, which corresponds to the Greek god of war, and, by extension, the planet Mars. In another cool detail, the new rideable Pokemon, Sneasler and Ursaluna, will get muddy if you run through the bogs in the Crimson Mylands. This only lasts for a few seconds, but adds a nice touch of realism. The GXY Hall building in Jubilife City is modeled after the former Hokkaido government office in Sapporo, Japan, which is the real-world inspiration for Jubilife City in the original games. One fun fact is that the map of Cobalt Coastlands features an area called Sans Reach, which is shaped like a hand. In addition, Hisuian Basculin shares the same typing and base stats as its original form, the only difference being its ability to evolve and its visual design. It's intriguing that a Hisuian form doesn't always require a stat or typing change. One of my favorite details is when encountering a Pidove in the wild. If you throw a berry at it, or if it sees you, it will freeze and pretend to be a tree. Its eyes will follow you slowly, and it won't seem to attack, which is a cute and peaceful interaction. Another cool detail is that in Legends Arceus, the Pokédex is more like a scrapbook with pictures and writing, instead of being a high-tech device. When you catch a Pokémon for the first time, its information isn't available immediately. You have to go back to the professor for evaluation. This makes sense because the Pokédex is now like a file of papers. Each Pokémon's picture is placed in the book with little folds, and if you've seen that Pokémon in its shiny form, you can replace the photo with a shiny version. Once you make the swap, the photo stays that way until you change it again. This is a cool touch, as the pictures are physically printed, unlike previous Pokédexes that always showed the default image of a Pokémon. Another interesting point is that Pokémon no longer hold items in Legends, but they can still drop items when caught or knocked out. One cute detail is that when an Aipom is knocked out or caught, it can drop Nab berries, which are based on bananas. Nab is banana spelled backward. Whenever you return to Jubilife City, a few Pokémon from your box will appear in the ranch area, though you can't interact with them directly. However, if you throw a Pokémon from your team at a certain angle, you can get them to interact with that Pokémon, but this only works with those near that part of the ranch. It's a fun and unique feature, even if it's a minor one. Raichu's Pokédex entry is quite similar to the original from Pokémon Green, and the translation from Pokémon Fire Red, with one notable change. The original entry states that Raichu's electric charges can reach up to 100,000 volts, and careless contact can cause even an Indian elephant to faint. However, the updated entry now mentions the Pokémon Karaja, which makes more sense. It's interesting how long it took for an elephant Pokémon to appear in the series. A common theme in Pokémon Legends is that many of the characters are based on those from the original Diamond and Pearl games, though this is never explicitly stated. There are small hints scattered throughout the world that suggest this connection. For example, Arazu's name is likely a reference to Ares, the Greek god associated with Mars, the home of Team Galactic's Mars. Another fun detail is that Sneasler and Ursaluna, the new riding Pokémon, get muddy if you pass through bogs in the Crimson Islands. The mud only lasts for a few seconds, but is a neat addition. The GXY Hall building in Jubilife City is modeled after the former Hokkaido government office in Sapporo, which is also the real-world inspiration for Jubilife City in the original Diamond and Pearl. If you look at the map of the Cobalt Coastlands, you'll notice an area called Sans Reach, which is shaped like a hand. Additionally, the High-End Basculin shares the same typing and base stats as its original form, with the only difference being its ability to evolve and its visual design. It's fascinating that a Pokémon doesn't necessarily need stat or type changes to be considered a new form. One of the cutest details in the game is when you encounter a Pudio in the wild. If you throw a berry at it, or it sees you, it will freeze and pretend to be a tree. Its eyes follow you as you walk around, and it doesn't seem to want to attack. In Pokémon Legends Arceus, when completing the Pokédex, the device is no longer a high-tech gadget, but more like a scrapbook with pictures and notes. When you catch a Pokémon for the first time, its Pokédex entry isn't available immediately. You have to go back to the professor to get it evaluated. This makes sense, since the Pokédex is now a physical scrapbook. If you've encountered a shiny Pokémon, you can swap the picture in the Pokédex for its shiny form, and it will remain that way until you decide to change it again. In Legends, Pokémon no longer hold items, but they can still drop items when they are knocked out or caught. For example, Aipom can drop Narb berries, which are named after bananas, since Narb is banana spelled backwards. When returning to Jubilife City, you can see Pokémon from your box hanging out at your ranch, though you can't interact with them directly. However, by throwing berries or other items in the right angle, you can get some Pokémon to interact with others. Lastly, there's an interesting feature when attempting to release a shiny Pokémon. In this game, if you give away a Pokémon, a message will pop up warning you that the Pokémon is rare, making sure you understand the action you're taking. This is something that should have been included in previous games, but surprisingly, this is the first main series game to do so. And yes, Pokemon Legends is a main series game. I previously mentioned a side quest involving giving NPCs Pokemon, but there's more to it. If an NPC asks for a Pokemon, and you fulfill the request, they will keep the exact Pokemon you gave them. It doesn't revert to a standard model, it retains its height, weight, and even shininess if you gave it one. Essentially, you could theoretically give every NPC in Jubilife a shiny Pokemon. There's also a small oversight in Jubilife, where you can throw a Pokemon onto one of the rooftops, which could make for some fun team photos. For something especially interesting, if you've done shiny hunting in Pokemon Sword and Shield, you know that in those games, a Pokemon's shininess is determined as soon as it appears. In Legends, however, this isn't the case. Once you fly to a location from Jubilife, every Pokemon in that area has already had its shininess determined. Additionally, spawn rates for Pokemon are no longer based on fixed percentages. For example, in Sword and Shield, there was a 15% chance of encountering a Growlithe on Route 3, but in Legends, spawns are more about general areas where Pokemon are fighting for a chance to appear. Combining these factors can lead to some interesting situations with shiny Pokemon. A friend of mine, while casually playing, encountered a shiny Growlithe, saved nearby, and failed to catch it. After resetting the game, the Growlithe spot was taken by a shiny Zubat, as if the RNG had swapped their places. It's a unique occurrence that could potentially be exploited, though it's not clear yet how or if it can be replicated. There's also a small motif related to Lorelei, a member of the Kanto Elite Four. She's known for collecting Pokemon plushies. An NPC in Fire Red and Leaf Green mentions this, stating that Lorelei buys plush toys every time she returns to Four Island after a loss. If you visit her house, you'll find it filled with plushies. After rematching the Elite Four several times, different plushies will be added to her collection. After 25 rematches, a Meowth plush appears. After 50, a Chansey plush. 75 adds an Aron plush. 100 brings a Jigglypuff plush. 125 adds a Metang male plush. 150 brings a Pidgeotto plush. 175 adds a Pidgeot plush. And after 200 rematches, a giant Lapras plush will appear. This detail, though rarely seen by players, is a fun reward for those who have the dedication to reach these milestones. A big shout out to the Channel Cube Game for providing footage of this, as completing these rematches is an incredible task. Finally, in March 2005, a Pokemon theme park opened in Nagoya, Japan, called Poke Park. It featured bumper cars, Ferris wheels, trains, and other rides. Most notably, you could connect your Game Boy Advance to machines that distributed exclusive gift Pokemon through eggs. There was a glitch where pressing X, Y, and down on the title screen of Heart Gold and Soul Silver unlocked a mic test screen with Jigglypuff, which I had never seen before. In Pokepark 2, most Pokemon use their anime voices instead of their usual cries from the main series games, which is interesting because Z from the Eons is in this game, and Porygon hasn't appeared in the anime yet. If you've ever wondered what Porygon sounds like, this is it, and it's strange. In Pokemon Go, each type has its own background that matches its characteristics, but pure flying type Pokemon, which are rare, never had a wallpaper until Tornadus was released. Tornadus remains the only Pokemon with this unique background. There are several locations in Pokemon games where it feels like you should encounter a Pokemon, but you don't. For example, in Generation 3, no Pokemon can spawn on the very first tile of a cave when you step inside. This happens in multiple generations. Another oddity occurs in Generation 1, where the 4 tiles around the fossils don't have any encounters even after you collect the fossils. Similarly, in Pokemon Emerald, when entering Meteor Falls, the first bridge has no encounters. In Generation 5, there's a surprising encounter detail that you might have missed. A single tile of grass won't spawn any Pokemon. It takes at least 2 grassy tiles to trigger an encounter. I tested this by walking through one patch over 100 times without a single encounter, which seems to encourage grinding for shaking grass encounters in tight areas. I've talked about shiny Pokemon before, but this next fact is one of the coolest. Shiny Pokemon changing appearance is rare. Many iconic shinies, like Charizard and Smeargle, changed in Generation 2, but after that, changes were minimal. However, in June 2013, a pre-release showcase of Pokemon X and Y revealed a shiny Go-Goat that never made it into the final game. This marked a rare instance where Game Freak not only showcased a shiny but later changed it, breaking the usual norm. It's unclear if this shiny Go-Goat was shown on purpose or by mistake. In Pokemon Emerald, there's a strange occurrence in the Battle Pike. When facing the Gentleman NPC, he has a Dusclops that uses Ice Beam when you enter. If you don't press the A button, you'll just get hit with Ice Beam while the NPC warns you. However, if you press A, the NPC will shout at his Dusclops to stop. This oddity wasn't discovered until 2021. At the Sky Pillar's second floor in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, there's a cracked floor tile that drops you onto a rock. This rock is normally part of the background, and standing on it doesn't do anything, but it's a fun, quirky detail. You can step off any time, but can't get back on unless you try again. The ability Poison Touch, introduced in Pokemon Black and White, originally had a 20% chance to poison the foe in the Japanese versions, while the international versions had a 30% chance. This gave players using the Japanese version a 10% disadvantage in battles when facing English versions. Lastly, in Generation 5, after selecting your starter Pokemon, you're immediately forced into a battle with Bianca, no matter which starter you choose. This battle is unavoidable.